Literature of quarantine, COVID-19, and the aesthetics of old age and illness. Can illness be accommodated in and translating into aesthetic forms? Welcome to Translating Illness. My name is Marta Arnaldi and I am a Lamy Research Fellow at the Queen's College, University of Oxford. Today's meeting features two very special guests. It is an honor for me to host and welcome Karen Leader and Matthew Reynolds. Karen is an award-winning translator, a writer, and a leading scholar of German culture. She is Professor of Modern German Literature at the University of Oxford, as well as a member of the Academy of Europe. Matthew Reynolds is Professor of English and Comparative Criticism at the University and a prize-winning novelist. He is also founder and chair of Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Research Centre. We cannot stress enough the importance of Karen's and Matthew's scholarship in the fields of comparative literature and translation studies. At the same time, I am fascinated by their commitment and ability to transform research into creative work and vice versa. This meeting, entitled The Disease of Translation, is a very rare opportunity for us to listen conjunctly to these two specialists of the borders, metamorphoses, and illnesses of today's world. With them, we will explore and explode between languages, disciplines, and media, including the often forgotten frontier between creativity and criticism. Before starting, as usual, I would like to kindly remind everyone to mic off during the presentation. Also, the event will be recorded and there will be space at the end for Q&A with today's guests. So please feel free to type questions and thoughts in the chat. And now I leave the floor to Matthew and Karen, starting with Matthew. Thank you.
Hi. Hi everyone. It's lovely to be here, and thank you very much for that introduction, Master. So I've just got a couple of things, quite unformed things to say that I hope will lead into discussion and also connect with what Karen's going to be saying in a minute. The first thing is about the language of medicine, in which I have no particular expertise, and the second thing is going to be about Dryden, the poet and translator John Dryden, who coined the phrase the disease of translation, which gives the title to this event. So first of all, I wanted to start about thinking about what to me is a kind of rather strange, language within a language, or perhaps language that crosses languages, the technical language of medicine as it is encountered by an ordinary person who doesn't know it, or only has a kind of impression, or isn't fluent in that language. And I think the terms of this encounter have shifted a little bit over the last year with COVID-19, because with all the the press conferences and the sharing of information, I think more of this technical language has spread into public discourse than was perhaps the case before. So terms like the R number and mRNA vaccines, etc., have become a little bit more familiar than previously. Nevertheless, though, I think the main feeling that people like me have about this body of language hasn't changed that much. And I just want to try and characterize my feeling about it for a moment. So on the one hand, this is an alien language. It's a language I don't understand. On the other hand, it's also a kind of intimate language in a way, because I'm aware that we are aware that it does vital work. It's part of processes that can, keep us alive and do things with our bodies to cure us and save us. It's a technical language, so it's designed not to be emotional, to be not emotional, really. But on the other hand, when ordinary people encounter it, it's very often in really upsetting or worrying circumstances. So even though this language is not in itself an emotionally expressive language, I think it can take on an emotional charge, and that emotional charge is complex. So it can be scary, It can also, I think, be consolatory, a little bit like religious language, a language of ritual, especially if you think of religious situations where the language spoken in the ritual is one that people kind of witnessing the ritual don't necessarily understand, like, you know, some instances of church, like Latin in some kinds of church service, for instance. So there's a kind of ritual aspect, I think, to our encounters with technical medical language, which can have a consolatory aspect. And finally, I think this language can have a strange relationship to, as it were, loss and mourning and grieving, because in a way, it seems to me that what I'm encountering, or what we are encountering, are words that kind of have had meaning drained out of them for us. So you kind of know it's language, but it's not speaking to you. So in a way, there's a kind of feeling of loss that can arise in this kind of encounter. So what does that mean for sort of making sense of it, or trying to write with it, or trying to live with it? And I started getting interested in this kind of language in a novel that I did a while ago now, called The World Was All Before Them, which came out in 2013. And it has a doctor as one of its characters, and through his consciousness, it brings quite a lot of medical language onto the page. And my idea there was that I wasn't expecting readers to learn or understand that language, but I wanted to kind of give the impression of this encounter with the language that you didn't understand, or the sort of the obstructedness that language brought with it. And the context for that work really was quite a long running. There's a lot of discussion and theory in literary studies about pain and illness being especially difficult to put into words. So a famous instance is Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill, in which she says, among other things, English, which can express the thoughts of Hamlet and the tragedy of Lear, has no words for the shiver and the headache. So, you know, if you're in love, or if you're in a tragic situation, you can come out with lots of similes and metaphors to express that, but that seems harder to do with illness and pain. So I was thinking maybe I can use technical medical language to bring onto the page, not to sort of express in the same way as you would in writing about love, say, but to bring onto the page some of these kind of mixed feelings, or this unease about the encounter with medical language that I've been describing. And I was looking for a bit of that I could read out, but I couldn't find one that was short enough, or that would be understandable in its context. So I thought I just wanted to read out a bit of something that I'm working on now, just to give you a taste of the kind of thing that I have in mind. So this is the description of an accident that happened in a hospital. So someone has had a terrible accident already. They've been brought into accident and emergency. They've been taken up to a trauma ward, and then what happens is, even more terribly, they manage to fall off the hospital bed and do themselves even more damage. And so what I wrote about this is the following. So you've got a description of the person. She opened her eyes and moved. Despite her broken pelvis and broken ribs and broken collarbone and fractured vertebrae and fractured skull and severe concussion, she moved. She thought she wanted to go to the loo, or check on my father, or make him some sandwiches, or go home. She rolled, she levered herself up and tipped. This is the room that put a dent in her forehead the size of an oyster. This is the room that put multiple locules of gas in her spinal canal. This is the room that gave her mid-cervical interspinous ligamentous injury and an acute traumatic cord injury of C4 to 5, as she encountered the floor as hard as a hammer, as smooth as a knife. And so what I felt I was trying to do there is that this language of ligamentous injury and locules of gas, I don't really understand it. It's brought onto the page from a medical report. So it's not, as it were, the translation of the injury into expressive language, but to me, and I guess this is the idea I want to share, that failure of translation there is in the writing here, you know, the failure to translate the reality of the injury into something comprehensible, has a kind of movingness to it, because that becoming inexpressive of the language creates a kind of injury in language, an injury in language too. So to me, there's a kind of failure to translate by bringing this technical language into the language of fiction. There's a sort of translation failure or translation effect there, a kind of obstruction. So that's a kind of, in a way, a failure to communicate, but that failure to communicate is itself a kind of injury. And that kind of injury in the language, I hope, has a sort of expressiveness or movingness about it. So let me connect to Dryden now. So at the same time as I was starting to, you know, do this kind of try to think about medical language in this way, I was also doing some scholarly research about John Dryden, the great 17th century poet, playwright and translator, who translated the complete works of Virgil, among many other things. And he said something that kind of helped me with the thinking I was trying to do. So in one of his prefaces, so he did collections of translations, often in collaboration with other people, and he wrote prefaces to them. And in one of the prefaces, he says the following: "For this last half year, I have been troubled with the disease, as I may call it, of translation. The cold prose fits of it, which are always the most tedious with me, were spent in the history of the League." So that's a long history book that he had to translate from French. The hot, which succeeded them in this volume of verse miscellanies. So this is bits of verse from Lucretius, Virgil, and others that he's presenting in this book. The truth is, I fancied to myself a kind of ease in the change of the paroxysm, never suspecting but that the humour would have wasted itself in 2 or 3 pastorals of Theocritus and as many odes of Horace. But then he says, having done that little bit of translation, he started rereading Lucretius and Virgil and decided to translate some parts that had most affected me in the reading. And he finds he can't stop. He kind of has to carry on until this thing that he's experiencing as a disease kind of works itself out. So there's a lot of scholarly detail one could go into here about Dryden's translations and the environment and 17th century ideas of disease, but I just want to try and draw out what I think to be the kind of main lines of what he's getting at by seeing translation as a disease. So the first thing is that translation is not just a technique, it's not just something you do with your mind, but it involves your feelings and your body as well, and you can't always control it. It can be hard to make it stop. And actually in the big kind of prose book, history book that he, with the cold fits of his illness, in that bit I read out, he was compelled to translate that because the king had ordered him to do it. So that's a kind of pretty straightforward kind of feeling of compulsion and tedium. But then he shifts from that, he moves to saying, I want to translate some poems as a kind of relief, or he feels compelled to move on to a different kind of translation. And this for him is the hot, the feverish or hot phase of his illness. And the kind of compulsion and inability to stop there is here, I think, is more complex and more inward. So his imagination and his feelings have got hooked. And I think probably there is something in translating more than just in reading that gets you hooked, and that is the trying to make a version that will be good enough, the trying to make a version that captures what matters about the poem you're trying to translate. And however hard you try, you know, you can have a feeling of success, but then the feeling of success can also pass. I think any sort of, okay, I've done my translation now, is always vulnerable to being ambushed by the feeling that the translation could be done differently, or it's not quite, you know, it's not quite there yet. So I think if you're just writing a book, you can finish it, but there's a sense in which translation can never be finished. And Dryden felt this vividly. So later on in the same preface, he says that Virgil, in particular, is a plague to translators. And the reason is that his writing is so subtle, you can never really feel you've done a good enough job. And Dryden then, you know, he spent more than a decade of his life translating the complete works of Virgil, and it's an amazing work of genius. It's a towering work of the imagination and of writing. But what he said when he'd finished was, "I've done great wrong to Virgil throughout the whole translation." So, I mean, Dryden does have happier ideas about translation as well. He doesn't always think of it like this. But it seems to me that when he's in this line of thought, so when translation is feeling like a disease to him, a dis-ease, it's because translation is a process that produces this specially kind of vulnerable sort of text that's always liable to revision, that's always liable to seem, to come to seem not quite right, to come to seem as though it needs correction, or it's to come to seem as though it's going to be disputed. So it produces this sort of uneasy or diseased kind of writing when he's thinking about it in this way. And the feeling of connection I had between this and what was interesting me and what I was worrying away out with medical language was the feeling that, okay, what if this vulnerability, this dis-ease in this translated language, that, this feeling that you can have about some kinds of translated language, what if this disease can also be a virtue? And I guess the feeling I had that connected to, from Dryden's reflections to questions around writing illness and translating illness, is that, what you might aim for in writing about illness is not, as it were, communication, so not triumphant clarity, not eloquence on the subject of illness, but rather the creation of a kind of vulnerability or disease in the writing. So a kind of failure to translate, which would nevertheless be expressive, a kind of expressive inexpressiveness, that I was trying to do in the bit of writing that I quoted earlier. So it seemed to me there was a harmony between that, as it were, what I felt to be a kind of translational mode of writing with medical language in this metaphor for translation that Dryden had come up with centuries before. So that's what I had to offer as a prompted discussion, and as some thoughts that I hope might connect with Karen's that are going to come now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for this wonderful presentation that really illuminated the bodily and mental dimension of translation as a practice, as a theory, as an art. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be questions later. I took some along the way. And now we move on to Karen, which I'm delighted, to whom I'm delighted to leave the floor.
Thank you very much, Marta. I really enjoyed Matthew's comments, and I think, interestingly, although we didn't confer really about what we were talking about, both structurally, in the sense that I have two parts to what I'm doing, one slightly more academic, one slightly more creative and one slightly more academic, and then also some reflections on disease, actually. They link together very well, so thank you. So first of all, I'm really delighted to be part of this, and I look back at some of the previous podcasts that I hadn't caught at the time, and was very struck by how expert everybody is in their interdisciplinary knowledge. And I come to this very much as an amateur, as a kind of translator who has branched a little into medical things, sciences, and particularly thinking about illness and lateness and aesthetics. But I'm offering just a few sort of personal remarks in a sense. First of all, some on the particular, some examples, and then a little bit thinking about general, and then by way of a confession, thinking about dis-ease. So I thought I would talk a little bit about translation and COVID, actually, to start with. COVID's already produced a great deal of writing and writing in translation, and a number of publications have appeared specifically devoted to translation. There was Poetry and COVID-19, edited by Anthony Kaleshua and Rory Waterman, and that was published by Shearsman in March this year, in which 19 UK poets responded or partnered with poets from around the world to work collaboratively, and I thought that was very interesting, on poems responding to the virus. The second was, and Kira, if you'd be so kind as to show now on screen, the second was published also this March, which was Clean Hands, a focus on the European pandemic, which is the spring 2021 issue of MPT, Modern Poetry and Translation, funded by the European Cultural Foundation for this issue. Thank you very much, Kira. Very striking cover, I think. Now, Modern Poetry and Translation is a very, it's just a fantastic publication. It was founded by Ted Hughes and Daniel Weisbord in 1965 and has been going ever since, and has had many distinguished translators, including David and Helen Constantine, Sasha Dugdale, and is now edited by Claire Pollard. Now, this issue I thought was really interesting about thinking about how COVID particularly and disease in that very particular context are translated into poetry as a sort of snapshot of the pandemic. The editor, Claire Pollard, in her introduction notes, I quote, "So many poems about smallness, laundry, a tree, birdsong, coffee, an egg, a bag of flour." And I think it's true, looking at these two works together, how little things have got magnified during COVID. I think there's an article to be written about insects, for example. There's so many poems about insects. Breath, shaking hands, washing, of course, it's obvious in a sense. But also, I thought very strikingly that despite the smallness, many of the poems are about making connections, and actually translating itself became thematized as a way of crossing borders. Don't forget that the first lockdown coincided with also, of course, Britain leaving the EU, and so there was a particular acuteness to borders being closed, people being locked away, and the need, the kind of lifeline that a collaborative exercise like translation provided. And there I thought that the Shearsman anthology with its collaborative production of poems was particularly interesting. Annie Rutherford talks about how these poetic exchanges felt necessary and defiantly joyful, and so a sense of breaking out. Of course, there are kind of very, there are poems that stage the being of the illness. Love in Lockdown by the German-Turkish poet Said Khan, translated by Martin Kratz, starts, "You're in Vienna and I'm in Offenbach," and that sense of the impossibility of meeting is very prominent in many of the poems. Another by the French poet Angèle Paoli, translated by Martin Crucifix, is a telephone call, is a sort of a transcript, in a sense, of an agonized telephone call across a long distance. That's not to say that the poems aren't political. In fact, the opposite. Many of the poems respond to the lying, the propaganda in various countries, but also look to a kind of moral injunction. How to explain to the children seems to be a common theme, or how to hold on to goodness. A poem by the Romanian poet Tatiana Tibulia, translated by Josefina Comporali, asks how one can hold on to goodness. And I'll just read a line for it. In a poem, Responsibility, I lean against the mirror, waiting to become a better person, a person who never grabs the last bag of flour, a person who wears a mask, blue side out, a person who goes to the hospital only to die. So a kind of larger political trope, I think, in this. But then, of course, the inevitable vocabulary, and I was interested that Matthew brought up vocabulary, the vocabulary of illness, of breathing, of hand washing, of shaking hands, of 2 meters distance, of watching the daily news with anxiety, and the language of COVID. That is ordinary language in a sense, but which has stepped up to achieve new significance and a new urgency. There's more to say to that. We might come back with that. Volker Braun, one of the poets, a German poet that I translated for the anthology, his poem within the anthology was Handshake, and how now we can't shake hands, but perhaps hands could be used for better things, for reaching across to someone in trouble. Now, that's in a sense some examples of the kinds of things it struck me, but I wanted to say something more general perhaps about aesthetics in these poems. I don't know whether one can say that the disease, in a sense, has changed the aesthetics in this particular. It's notable, I think, that there were many examples of very short poems. One whole sequence was inspired by the window swap project, initiated by Stanza, in which paired poets wrote poems about the view outside their window. So short, very concrete poems, for example. But others, again, equally reached back to compare contagion historically in longer, searching poems. One by Jan Wagner, translated by Ian Galbraith, turned to the past, a plague of 1338, a plague of locusts. David Constantine turned to the ancient Greek. So there was a sense of longer, more searching poems, sequences of poems, trying to make a narrative out of illness, which seemed to me very striking as well. But I think poets do try and experiment. And if Kira could just show the poem, another of the poems by Volker Braun, this is called Catharsis. I hope people can see it okay. This comes from a sequence of his called Great Fugue, Große Fuge, and in the German Fuge has within it FUG, Fugue, which is the equivalent of FUO, fever of unidentified origin in English. But also, of course, it points to Beethoven, Beethoven's late 13th symphony, which was reviled on publication because of its unintelligibility. And here I think one gets a glimpse of a kind of aesthetics of quotation. There are quotations in English, for example, that are left in English. There are crossings out. There's backtracking. There are sentences that don't quite make sense. I've had to even include a little selection of notes at the end in order that one can see what's going on. So a very complex poem, fragmented and yet reaching across through its different quotations as a kind of building commonality. That by way of just a sort of glance, it's a very brilliant sequence which will be coming into English, which is published in Germany this May and will come into English in September 2022. But I wanted to also give a second example, which is very different. And this is a poem I translated by Ulrika Almuth-Sandig, a young German poet, called in German Anleitung zum Lachen auf Abstand, which might be translated as instructions for laughing at a distance. But of course, actually, as soon as one makes the link to Corona, it of course has to be guidance for laughing at a distance. A kind of prose poem, but it's also received a further aesthetic translation through music by the poetry band Landschaft, which she is part of, and through film with the filmmaker Sascha Conrad and the paper artist Stephanie Conrad. I think we'll just have a clip, if we may, from Kira. You have my translation flashed up.
Anleitung zum Lachen auf Abstand. Zuerst die schlechte Nachricht. Alles, was dir alles war, verkleinert sich auf die Größe eines Insekts am geschlossenen Fenster. Aber das tut es auch dann, wenn du diese Anleitung nicht befolgst. Jetzt müsste eigentlich die gute Nachricht kommen. Aber wissen wir denn, wer nach dieser Anleitung zum Lachen auf Abstand noch da ist? Das Insekt oder Lins Ex oder Lin oder ihre uralten, lachenden Eltern? Und jetzt die gute Nachricht. Scheiß auf alle Prachtalleen und Plätze. Wir werden einander in Forsten begegnen. Der ganze Sauerstoff wird uns richtig high machen. Und hier gehen wir ein wenig auf Abstand, Hände locker an die Seite, rechter Fuß zurück, linker Fuß zurück und immer so weiter. Es wird ein ganz neues Gefühl sein, die Natur dabei zu betrachten, wie sie dich geschmeidig überholt. In eine Rinde werden wir ritzen, Lin war hier. In einer anderen Rinde werden wir lesen, komm her, gleich, geh weg. Wir werden die Heiterkeit zwischen den Bäumen ausbuchstabieren. Und das geht so, kurz bücken, Hände im Laub waschen, dabei zweimal Happy Birthday singen. Happy Birthday für dich, die Geschenke für mich. Den Kuchen musst du suchen, doch du findest ihn nicht. Jetzt müsste sich das Lachen eigentlich schon bemerkbar machen. Die meisten spüren ein deutliches Kratzen am Kehlkopf und zwar genau hier. Happy Birthday, Lin, werden wir rufen und über die Antwort im Echo der Bäume ein heftiges Lachen ausbrechen.
Oh, thank you, Kira. That's wonderful. I was getting so into that. I could have listened to a lot more, but never mind. Anybody who'd like to see the rest, it's just been released as a single, and it will and it's available on Sandeep's website. Perhaps I just sort of come to a conclusion now with the turn, in a sense, from the practical creative to a sort of brief academic reflection, which is to say that I've done a good deal of work on illness and writing, particularly in the context of lateness, of old age writing, or what might better be called writing in the proximity of death. That's borrowing a phrase from Gordon MacMullen. And now, of course, this idea of late writing and old age writing has translated from music and art, particularly into literary studies, where it has become very important. One might say cynically, as the academy ages, so the interest in aging has grown, but also in the aesthetics of aging. And I'm thinking here of a book like Edward Said's Late Style, which came out in 2007, which argues first that a kind of late style exists. There's a certain point when people transcend their previous style and achieve a kind of serenity and transcendence in old age. And you think of some of the works, you think of Picasso, or a sort of naivety and a primitivism even, or Turner. And he argues against that with another form of old age writing, which is based on a kind of raging against the dying of the light, and which is based on contradiction and anachronism and discordance. Now one tends to think, there one can think of Beethoven, precisely Beethoven's late works. Now one tends to think always of illness as a sort of negation of style, a negation of such thing, of competence, a sort of falling off, if you like. But one of the things I explore is sort of stimulated by a quotation from Samuel Beckett, which I'll just read, which rethinks that and thinks particularly of one aspect of old age writing, which is amnesia, as something potentially very productive aesthetically. He says, it's a paradox, but with old age, the more the possibilities diminish, the better chance you have. With diminished concentration, loss of memory, obscured intelligence, what you, for example, might call brain damage, the more chance there is for saying something closest to what one really is. Even though everything seems inexpressible, there remains the need to express. A child needs to make a sandcastle even though it makes no sense. In old age, with a few grains of sand, one has the greatest possibility. So turning the idea of an aesthetics of illness into something positive, I mean, this argues perhaps with, but also against Matthew and what he was saying. And then finally, by way of a confession, I kind of missed the significance of disease of translation until very late in the day when I was thinking about this session. And I thought of sort of 3 points, in a sense, which link again with Matthew's, I hope. First of all, one might think about how translation functions as a disease or a dis-ease, how it charts, if you like, the changing of a body of text, the metabolizing of a text into something else, a deformation perhaps, but also possibly a coming into a new way of being. So that was a first sort of theme. Second, a kind of COVID lexicon. So coming back to my very concrete examples, the way in which, like many illnesses, the way they've entered the language as a threat, and the response is militaristic and strategic. And one is reminded about Susan Sontag's essay on AIDS and its metaphors, or of course the language of cancer. Illness is an attack on the body and society and needs to be responded to with a language and metaphors related to that. And then finally, my last point, the way that words like pandemic, lockdown, social distancing often are taken up literally in English in many languages, but have stepped out of normal usage and become marked by this particular experience in a way that means they'll never be the same again. I'll stop there, I think, because there are several things where I would link with Matthew and pick up on him, but I hope that offers fruit, offers one beautiful video and some fruit for thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, also for your wonderful contribution. I think there are so many thoughts we could discuss together, and so many threads to be brought together. So as we wait for some questions from the audience, if there are any questions, I just would like perhaps to draw on one of Karen's latest thoughts, which ties in with what Matthew was saying before, which is this paradoxical role of translation, which on the one hand is a disease or can be pathological or can sustain pathology. And on the other hand, the fact that translation is a form of survival. It provides an afterlife to text, but also to human beings, if we think, about the replication of ourselves and everything, but also in terms of culture. It guarantees the survival of culture. So I was wondering whether you would like to discuss together about this double nature of translation, both as a pathology as in therapeutics, if that makes sense. If you have any thoughts on the authors you studied or you read or you translated or the novels you wrote.
Well, I mean, I think that, that view of translation is much the best and the most widespread and the most dominant. I mean, that is what to me, translation is generally a matter of, making new life, regeneration, recreation, etc., etc. It's a kind of, endlessly proliferative process of writing. So the kind of thing I was pointing to, seems to me to be a sort of a small expressive possibility within that general kind of, you know, fountain of remaking, as it were. Something it kind of, hearing you reminded me of is a kind of famous instance of creative translation into English by Pound, which is his version of Homage to Sextus Propertius from the Latin. And his sense of what he was doing there was these are poems that had been kind of rather kind of murdered by academic translators during the 19th century. And his sense of, and then he kind of produced creative translations that were then criticized by classicists for having kind of invented meanings that weren't really there. But what he said about the metaphor that he brought in for what he was doing was what I wanted to do was to bring a dead man to life. And my sense of, but you see, I think in fact, in that poem, there's a kind of perpetual struggle. So there are aspects of it where you say, well, okay, here is the voice of the speaker of the poem being recreated in hearable, poetic English. But then there are other bits, and I'm going to fail to remember any quotations. But then there are other bits that are much more like the sort of translation-y, so language that doesn't really work as poetry. And I think that's a kind of designed thing he's doing on purpose, which is to say a struggle between a mode of writing that says I can take someone from the past and sort of bring them to life in the present, listen to them in their idiomatic language that I'm creating for them on the one hand, and on the other hand, actually, no, I can't do that. Actually, there are things I can't bring across. And it seems to me that in a way, both those aspects need to be recognized, because if on the one hand you say, of course I can bring the dead poet to life, then that's sort of necessarily appropriative and over optimistic. So I think the sense of on the one hand, celebrating the generativity of translation, while also a sort of a positioning of that, so that it doesn't, as it were, kind of overwhelm and take over what it's a translation of. So that's what I was thinking about in relation to what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, you've put me in mind of a sort of agonistic struggle that happens sometimes in translated poems. I've just written, weirdly enough, about translations of Shakespeare's sonnets into German and sketched in a kind of history. I'm thinking of that quotation from one of the sonnets where it talks about millions of strange shadows. And indeed, this sort of penumbra of translations around Shakespeare's sonnets are shadows, but they are strange shadows, all of them giving new life to the sonnets, Shakespeare's sonnets, which after all themselves are about reproduction and living on beyond death. But it's a different life. It's a strange life. And in some of the most recent so-called radical translations, you actually have a contemporary author changing the translation beyond recognition in many ways. For example, Ulrike Dresner, German poet, fusing Shakespeare's sonnets with genetic experimentation on Dolly the sheep, so taking reproduction in a very literal way, and the poems are full of the jargon of genetic reproduction, and yet in a sense true to the spirit. Or another one by Franz Josef Czernin, where he himself fights with Shakespeare in the poem. And so in each of these examples, there is a kind of staging of the giving new life to, but also the anxiety of influence suffered by the translator. After all, they're dealing with Shakespeare, and that kind of struggle for life beyond the poem. So I think your idea of the doubling is actually very interesting and something that I recognize, the kind of pathological and the survival precisely in the poem.
Thank you so much for this. As you were talking, I was actually reflecting on these on the stages, on the staging that translation does of life and death, birth and death, and perhaps proposes translation a more fluid also understanding of states of life, this state in between where death is in life, and life extends onto death. So this particular in between us that translation harnesses. And we have a question from Yin, I think, if I don't mispronounce the name. I will just read it for both of you. To what extent do either of you think the disease of translation derives not as much from the typical aporetic predicament in which the translator finds his or herself, for example, Dryden's disease of doing Virgil ill, but from the authors infecting the translator? Translation as an empathic, often unprotected form of contact with the author's predicament or even pathology. Thank you for this question.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. I like that idea. Karen, do you have any instances? I'm just trying to.
Well, my instant thought is yes. The unprotected. I mean, that's about the traffic, isn't it? The traffic between the translator and the writer. And I was put in mind of, it's a different set of metaphors, and I've talked about it before, but I find it very striking, of Don Patterson talking about translating Rilke, but translating per se, and about how that concentrated interaction with an author stretches your own or changes your own ways of thinking, opens new neural pathways in the brain, shifts the possibilities of thinking. And he uses the likeness of rivers. So, you know, a path, a river takes a new path in your brain. And then when you finish the translation, those paths remain. So there is that stretching of language, that possibility. And one could see that, of course, as an infection. You know, you only need shift very slightly to see that as an infection for both better and ill.
Yes, thank you so much for this. Matthew, would you like to add anything?
Oh, just but also the sort of sense of, you know, of things happening through the translation kind of by accident or not on purpose. So I think sometimes discussions of translation sort of ascribes a lot of agency to, and, you know, conscious control to the translator, as that, but you know, things just happen. I mean, one of the things I've been working on is many translations of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So these are not kind of, you know, high literary poetry translations, great works of craft. They're, you know, the translations often done, you know, at speed, you know, by people who are, you know, many of them great translators in many ways, etc. But what you can see then is the sort of just the kind of stuff happening, things spreading. I don't know, you can reach for different metaphors for it, but kind of, as it were, things happening through the contact of the language that you can't say, okay, this is, you know, Ezra Pound's mastering work in what's going on here. It's just a kind of something spreading through the contact of the languages. Mm. I mean, I think, you know, we can reach for, you know, there are lots and lots of different metaphors that people bring to bear on translation, and that's because, you know, the word translation itself has quite a limited metaphor inscribed within it, whereas actual contact between languages is a very infinitely varied and complex thing that you can sort of spin and understand. You can see different things happening in it, and I'm sure I like this suggestion.
Thank you so much, both. We have two more questions. So the first one is from Audrey. Thank you for these very interesting talks. Thinking of translation as disease and dis-ease brings the translator's body into the discussion as well, the physicality of the translative process. As a translator, I feel my body going through different stages while translating, and it can be painful at times, exhilarating, delirious at others. So, do you recognize, do you empathize or sympathize with this view as translators yourself?
Yeah, I like that. Karen, you translate a lot more than me, so you must.
Well, that's interesting. That's so interesting. I recognize both exhilaration and despair. And also just sitting, when you read the Dryden about that kind of creeping obsession, I think it's quite, once one's translating, well, there are two different things. I noticed a question coming up about poetry and prose, but I think that when one's translating prose, there is a sense of it being more to do with work, that, you know, if you're translating a long novel, you do a certain amount a day. And of course you can get carried away, but with poetry, I think you can get carried away. That can be the exhilaration of being carried away very physically. And so you keep going into the night or until your bottom is hurting on the chair. Or there is that absolute crumbling despair where you're stuck and you can't do anything. So I do recognize that, certainly. I think it is a bodily business, perhaps more for some people than others. And of course, it's a kind of gendered business as well. You're bringing a different body or a different set of experiences to a text.
Thank you. And from Heike, Corinna Wagner opens her anthology About Your Work, published in 2016, with a haiku by Peter Reading, I think. Verse, I quote the haiku. Verse is for healthy arty-farties. The dying and surgeons use prose. Unquote. Does this perhaps raise genre-related questions of translating illness in prose and in poetry, art, and science? Thank you for this question as well.
That's a lovely quotation, isn't it? I'm going to answer because I have an immediate response. I'm sure something will link with Matthew. But it also struck me when Matthew was talking about medical language as well, as a sort of being a vulnerability in the text. And it reminded me of a piece I translated by Jos Gloombein when he got the Zbigniew Herbert Prize this last autumn. And he talks about how he'd been inspired by Herbert, particularly to bring the vocabulary of the mundane, the vocabulary of the everyday, and scientific vocabulary into his verse, something that Gloombein does as well. And the example he used was that medical language can refresh poetry because it doesn't belong to the traditional realm of poetry. And of course, if one thinks about the many poets that engage with contemporary physics or contemporary medical discourses, it does bring a very rich and exotic world of vocabulary, a very suggestive world of vocabulary into poetry, which is sort of novel and surprising and very rich. I think it's dangerous too, because it can become fetishized for itself, but at its best, it becomes something actually that expands what traditional poetry has been about and makes it porous, and, to borrow that phrase again, refreshes it. So I'd say that poetry doesn't need to be absent from that kind of language.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I mean, there is a real we've been talking about translation being seen in terms of disease or otherwise, so metaphors of translation. But just sort of turning it the other way around. I mean, I do. I completely agree with what Karen's saying. It has been it is a problem, I think, or a sort of thing. I mean, also, it's a thing for literature, but it's also a thing for everybody, going to a hospital. So the kind of peculiarity of that experience, the peculiarity of that sort of aesthetic experience, but also language experience, I think is very, I find it very haunting. And then it's sort of, but it's something, in everybody's. So I don't want to sort of draw a distinction between, literary writing on the one hand and everybody's use of language on the other. Do you see what I mean? I think it's sort of an issue for everyone. And I think it has, one of the things about the language of COVID is the great proliferation of cliches. So it's things like you don't just increase vaccine production, you ramp it up, etc., etc. So these endlessly sort of vivid cliche language, but also, when someone is ill. So I remember when Boris Johnson was ill, somebody saying, well, okay, he'll be fine because he's a fighter. He said, well, that's completely irrelevant. I can see why somebody would want to reach for that kind of thing. You say, okay, I want to reach for this sort of metaphor in a consolatory way. But obviously it's completely irrelevant whether someone is a fighter or not. And indeed, obviously, implicitly offensive to other people, are other people not fighting hard enough, etc., etc. So the sort of, there's a way in which I think one of the things that's really struck me over the last year is the sort of, on the one hand, the need to reach for a figurative language, because that's what people do in these situations. But on the other hand, again and again, the kind of inappropriateness of that figurative, you know, the everyday language made figurative in order to cope with a situation of medical difficulty. And I just think it is a sort of, I think how to, you know, it is so this is a language behavior problem, it's a translation problem, but sort of what to do linguistically in these situations, I think it is a real, it's, you know, it's really interesting and something that, you know, everyone can, I don't know, could contribute to or kind of think about, but it's a sort of, yeah, anyway, so I sort of, there's a kind of, so you go there and that there is something that the really, you know, the thing that Virginia Woolf said about headaches, you know, you go to that sort of situation and it's really difficult to know what to do linguistically. And I think one sort of move towards helping with that is the kind of thing, Karen, you've been pointing to, which is to say, but, you know, drawing in actually something that is a technical medical word or another technical medical, you know, just sort of moving, rather than saying, okay, when I go to hospital, I'm going into an alien specialist environment where I feel ill at ease, actually just sort of working a little bit to bridge that translational space, I guess, by changing language rather than by bringing in, you know, old inappropriate metaphors.
This is so interesting. There are so many thoughts coming to my mind, but I was just thinking, it is quite striking that the experience of disease, as we discussed it today, probably one of the experiences in life that makes us and makes us also feel most vulnerable, is expressed in two very technical languages. On the one hand, we have the language of medicine, on the other we discussed the language of literature and specifically the language of poetry. So there is, I think, a lot to explore in terms of aesthetics of illness in these terms. And perhaps translation as a poetics is also a notion and a field that stretches beyond the usual consideration of translated literature, translated canons, and so on. Perhaps it is a whole new genre, or anyway, a cross genre, as we discussed. And also, the final point I would like to address is this language of vulnerability, which I think very much Matthew mentioned it, but I think it was at the heart of Karen's talk as well. And the way in which illness basically establishes the limits of language, or in a sense shows the limits of language and its inexpressibility and so on and so forth. But at the same time, these failures in language, as you described it, are specifically the spaces where creativity comes into being. And as Ome Baba said, it is in translation that culture is produced. So I think that there is a lot that you offered us to think about. And yes, I mean, there will be so many threads we need to reflect upon. And if there are not any other questions, since I am conscious of the time, just before ending this meeting, I would like to thank both Karen and Matthew for their very generous contribution to this series, which was absolutely tremendous, wonderful. Thank you for showing us the ways of reading and writing illness, including the diseases linked to the current crisis, with words both ancient and new. And thank you for exploring how and why translation can be a path towards the future, and for reminding us that translation is not just a theory or a tool or a metaphor, but it is also a form of imagination whose aesthetic potential bears sociological and political implications that are relevant across the languages and cultures of today's world. Finally, I would like to thank Kira Alma for providing tech support and all the participants for their presence and questions. The next Translating Illness event will take place on the 27th of May, and we will discuss translation and mental health. More information will be circulated soon. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Master.
Thank you.